I never thought a small stream on my property would become the battleground for the most absurd war I'd ever fight. But here I was, staring at a newly constructed wooden walkway that stretched brazenly across water that belonged to me. My name is Vincent Larson, and I'd purchased this beautiful 5-acre property in rural Greene County, Tennessee, 3 years ago. The house sat on a gentle hill overlooking a natural stream that meandered through the eastern portion of my land. It wasn't a massive waterway, maybe 8 feet across at its widest point, but it was mine according to every survey, deed, and county record that existed. The previous owner had even installed a small footbridge on my side of the property line, which I'd rebuilt last summer with treated lumber and proper railings. The trouble started when the HOA for the neighboring development, Riverside Estates, decided they wanted better access to what they called community nature areas. Never mind that those nature areas were actually private properties belonging to people like me who predated their cookie-cutter subdivision by decades. I first noticed something was wrong on a Tuesday morning in late March. I'd taken my coffee out to the back deck as usual, enjoying the sound of water flowing over rocks, when I spotted fresh construction through the trees. At first, I thought maybe someone was doing work on their own property. But as I walked closer, my stomach dropped. They'd built a walkway. Not just a simple path, but an elaborate wooden boardwalk structure that crossed my stream at its widest point, complete with decorative railings and what looked like permanent concrete footings driven into my stream bed. The thing was maybe 40 feet long, connecting the HOA's common area to what they apparently considered a trail system on the other side of my property. I stood there in disbelief, my boots sinking slightly into the soft earth near the water's edge. The construction was fresh, probably completed within the last day or two. Wood shavings still littered the ground, and I could smell the sharp scent of pressure-treated lumber. They hadn't asked permission. They hadn't even bothered to notify me. I pulled out my phone and took about 50 photos from every angle, documenting everything. Then I walked the length of the structure, noting how the concrete footings had disturbed the natural flow of the stream and already started creating small pools of stagnant water upstream. This wasn't just a property rights violation. It was environmental damage. Back at the house, I pulled out my property survey and deed documents. Clear as day, my property line extended 10 feet beyond the far side of the stream. This walkway wasn't even close to being on HOA property. They'd trespassed, built a permanent structure without permission, and damaged a natural waterway, all without a single word to me. I decided to start with the reasonable approach. I found the HOA management company's number on their website and called that afternoon. Riverside Estates HOA, this is Brenda speaking. Hi Brenda, my name is Vincent Larson. I own the property adjacent to your development on the eastern side. I'm calling because someone from your HOA has built a structure on my land without permission. There was a pause. Can you hold, please? Elevator music filled my ear for about 3 minutes before a new voice came on the line. Mr. Larson, this is Patricia Henderson. I'm the HOA president. Brenda mentioned you have some concerns about our new nature walkway. Concerns is putting it mildly, Mrs. Henderson. You've built a walkway across my stream and onto my property without asking permission or even notifying me. I need it removed immediately. Well, I think there's been some confusion, Patricia said, her voice taking on that particular condescending tone that set my teeth on edge. That stream is part of the natural watershed for the area, which makes it community property. And the land on both sides has always been understood to be part of the trail system for residents. Understood by whom? I have a deed that says otherwise. The stream runs through my property, and so does the land on both sides. I have surveys and county records to prove it. Mr. Larson, I don't think you realize that when you live next to a planned community, there are certain expectations about community access and enjoyment of natural features. Our residents have been using those trails for years. Using trails is different from building permanent structures, Mrs. Henderson, and those trails, if they exist, are also on my property without my permission, but we can deal with that later. Right now, I need that walkway removed. I'm afraid that's not going to happen, she said flatly. The walkway was approved by our architectural committee and installed by licensed contractors at considerable expense to our HOA budget. It's staying put. If you have a problem with that, you're welcome to take it up with our legal counsel. The call ended shortly after, with me considerably more angry than when it started. Patricia Henderson had basically told me to pound sand on my own property. I'd dealt with difficult people before, but the sheer audacity of building on someone else's land and then refusing to remove it was breathtaking. That evening, I drove into town and spoke with Tom Richardson, a real estate attorney who'd handled my property purchase 3 years ago. I explained the situation and showed him the photos. Tom whistled low. That's bold, even for an HOA. They've committed at least 3 different violations here. Trespassing, construction without permit on private property, and potentially environmental damage depending on whether that stream is protected. What are my options? Well, the legal route is straightforward but slow. We file an injunction, demand removal, potentially sue for damages. That could take 6 months to a year and cost you several $1,000s, though you'd likely win. What's the faster option? Tom leaned back in his chair. Nothing illegal, understand, but you own that property. If something on your property is causing you problems, you're generally within your rights to modify your own land as you see fit, as long as you're not violating any environmental laws or county codes yourself. I thought about that on the drive home. The stream that ran through my property originated from a natural spring about a quarter-mile upstream, still on my land. It flowed through my 5 acres, then continued downstream through what used to be open farmland but was now mostly owned by the county as a nature preserve. The HOA development sat on higher ground to the west, with their common areas carefully positioned to give residents the illusion of bordering wild nature while actually bordering my property. The next morning, I visited the Greene County Planning Office and spoke with a clerk named Sarah Mitchell. I need to know what permits, if any, I need to do some water management on my property, I told her. What kind of water management? There's a natural stream that runs through my land. I'm considering creating a small pond by redirecting part of the flow, completely on my own property. Sarah pulled up some information on her computer. For a pond on private property, you'd need to file for a water use permit if you're planning to dam a significant waterway. How big is this stream? Maybe 8 feet across, relatively shallow, low flow most of the year. That should be fine for a small pond project. You'll need to submit an application showing the proposed changes, and someone from the county will come inspect to make sure you're not creating flooding risks or damaging protected wetlands. There's a $200 filing fee. I filled out the paperwork right there, describing my plan to create a retention pond and alternative drainage system on my property. I wasn't lying. That was exactly what I planned to do. I just wasn't mentioning that it would also leave the HOA's precious walkway spanning a dry ditch. The county inspector came out 5 days later. His name was Frank Morrison, a weathered man in his 60s who'd been doing this job for decades. "Show me what you're thinking," he said. I walked him up to the spring source. The water comes out here pretty steadily. I want to dig a small retention pond in this natural depression, maybe 30 by 40 feet, 3 to 4 feet deep. Then redirect overflow to follow this natural drainage channel to the west. Frank examined the area, took some notes, checked the grade with a handheld level. This drainage channel follow your property line, stays on my property until it reaches that gully about 200 yards west. That's county land. And downstream from your current stream, what's down there? County Nature Preserve. But here's the thing, Frank. I showed him photos of the HOA's walkway. Some folks built this structure across the stream without my permission. It's actually damaging the natural flow, creating stagnant pools. Frank's expression hardened. They get a permit for this, not from me, and I own the land. I don't know if they tried to pull one from the county. He took out his own phone and snapped several photos. They didn't. I'd remember a project like this. This is going to be a problem for them. Meanwhile, your pond and drainage project looks fine. You're actually improving water management by creating retention. Approved. I got my permit 3 days later. The next morning, I rented a small excavator and got to work. Digging the pond took most of a week. I'm handy with machinery from my years working construction in my 20s, and the ground was soft enough near the spring. I created a nice oval depression, sloping the sides gently and leaving the bottom slightly concave. The spring water immediately started filling it, and within 2 days, I had a respectable little pond forming. The trickier part was redirecting the overflow. I dug a careful channel following the natural western drainage pattern. It required moving several cubic yards of earth, but nothing too complicated. I used some of the displaced soil to create a low berm on the eastern side, gently blocking the original stream bed without creating an obvious dam. The water, as water does, followed the path of least resistance. Within hours of completing the western channel, the flow started shifting. By the next morning, my new pond was maintaining a steady level, with overflow running cheerfully down the western drainage toward the county land. The original stream bed started drying up immediately. I'll admit, I felt a little guilty watching the water level drop in what had been a pretty constant stream. But that guilt evaporated when I remembered Patricia Henderson's dismissive tone, her assumption that she could just take what she wanted from my property because her HOA had decided it was convenient. It took about 3 days for the stream bed to dry completely. 3 days of gradually decreasing flow until there was nothing left but damp earth, some puddles in the deeper spots, and a lot of confused crayfish seeking shelter under rocks. And spanning this increasingly pathetic scene was the HOA's beautiful wooden walkway, leading nowhere and crossing nothing. I was having coffee on my deck when I heard the first sounds of distress from the direction of the development. Raised voices, the particular pitch of indignation. I smiled into my mug. The first official contact came that afternoon. A phone call from an unknown number. "Mr. Larson, this is Patricia Henderson. What have you done to the stream?" "Hello, Mrs. Henderson. I've done some water management on my property. Created a pond and redirected some drainage, all permitted and legal. You've destroyed a natural waterway. That's environmental vandalism. I've modified the water flow on my own property with full county approval. If you have concerns about the environmental impact of my permitted work, you're welcome to contact Greene County Planning. This is because of our walkway, isn't it? This is some petty revenge scheme, Mrs. Henderson. I made a reasonable request for you to remove a structure you built illegally on my property. You refused. I then took legal action on my own land to improve my water management. The fact that your walkway no longer spans a functional stream isn't my problem. We'll sue you for this. For what? Improving my own property with proper permits. I look forward to that lawsuit. Do make sure your lawyers are aware that you built a structure on my land without permission first. I'm sure that'll be an interesting conversation. She hung up without another word. Over the next few days, I watched the comedy unfold from a distance. Residents from Riverside Estates kept walking down to stare at the dry streambed in confusion. The walkway, which had probably cost the HOA several $1,000s, now looked absurd spanning a ditch. Some kids used it as a skateboard ramp for a while, until someone from the HOA chased them off. I received a certified letter from the HOA's legal counsel, a firm called Morrison and Associates out of Nashville. The letter demanded I restore the stream immediately and threatened legal action for environmental damage, property devaluation, and disruption of community amenities. I took the letter to Tom Richardson. "They don't have a leg to stand on," Tom said after reading it. "You have permits. The work is on your property, and their structure was illegal to begin with. Want me to respond, please?" Tom's response was a thing of beauty. 3 pages of legal language that boiled down to, "My client acted legally on his own property. Your client built an unpermitted structure on his property without permission. Remove your structure, pay damages for trespassing and environmental harm, or face a countersuit." For a couple of weeks, things went quiet. The walkway remained, spanning its dry ditch. My pond was thriving, and I'd even stocked it with some bluegill and bass. The western drainage worked perfectly, managing the water flow without any issues. Then I got a visit from the county. It wasn't Frank Morrison this time, but his supervisor, a woman named Carol Peters from the Environmental Management Office. She had a very official clipboard and a very serious expression. "Mr. Larson, we've received complaints about modifications to a natural waterway on your property." "I have permits for all my work," I said, pulling out my folder of documents. She reviewed them carefully. "These are in order, but the complaint suggests you've destroyed a stream to harm a neighboring property. Come with me." I walked her through the whole situation. Showed her the spring source, the new pond, the western drainage channel. Then I walked her down to the HOA's walkway and showed her photos of how it looked before, with the structure crossing my stream. "They built this without your permission." Without permission, without permits on my property. I asked them to remove it. They refused, so I did legal water management on my land. Carol took extensive notes and photos. "Mr. Larson, I'm going to be honest. Your work is legal and properly permitted. But we're going to have to investigate their structure now. If they built across a waterway without permits, that's a county violation. If they built on your property without permission, that's trespassing. And if they filed false complaints about you, that's going to create additional problems for them. I appreciate your thoroughness. Expect a full report in 2 weeks. In the meantime, your pond looks great. Good depth for fish." Carol's investigation opened up a can of worms for Riverside Estates HOA that made my situation look simple. Turned out, the walkway wasn't their only unpermitted construction. They'd also built 3 other nature structures on what they thought was common land, but was actually either county property or belonged to other private landowners who just hadn't noticed yet. The county sent them a cease and desist letter and a fine of $1,500 for unpermitted construction. Additionally, they were ordered to remove all structures built on property they didn't own within 30 days or face additional fines of $500 per day. Patricia Henderson called me directly this time, her voice tight with anger. "Are you happy now? The county is making us tear down structures that benefit the entire community. Mrs. Henderson, I'm happy that the law is being enforced. You built on property that wasn't yours. There are consequences for that. This is going to cost the HOA thousands of dollars. Our residents are furious. Then maybe next time you'll get permission before building on someone else's land. And maybe you'll think twice before telling someone to take it up with your lawyers when they make a reasonable request. You're a spiteful, petty man. I'm a property owner who enforced his rights when someone else decided those rights didn't matter. There's a difference. The 30-day deadline came and went. The walkway across my dry stream bed remained, as did the other structures. The HOA apparently decided to gamble that the county wouldn't follow through with the escalating fines. They gambled wrong. The fines started accruing at $500 per day. After 2 weeks, the HOA owed an additional $7,000. After a month, it was $15,000. The county wasn't playing around. I heard through the local grapevine that the HOA held an emergency meeting. Residents were livid about the fines coming out of their collective budget. Some were calling for Patricia Henderson's resignation. Others wanted to sue me personally, though apparently their lawyers had explained in very clear terms why that would be a terrible idea. Finally, in late June, I saw a work crew arrive at the walkway. They spent a day dismantling it, pulling up the concrete footings and hauling everything away. They did a sloppy job of cleanup, leaving the stream bed even more disturbed than before. I took more photos and sent them to Carol Peters. 2 days later, I received a very apologetic call from a different HOA board member, a man named Robert Chen, who'd apparently just been elected in an emergency shake-up after Patricia was voted out. Mr. Larson, I want to apologize on behalf of Riverside Estates for everything that's happened. The previous board made a series of terrible decisions without proper research or consideration for property rights. I appreciate that, Mr. Chen. We've removed the structures as ordered. However, the county is now requiring us to restore the areas we disturbed to their natural state. We'd like to hire a professional to restore the stream bed where our walkway was. Would you be willing to allow workers on your property to complete that restoration? At your expense, completely. We just need permission to access the area. Send me a detailed plan of what you intend to do, have it approved by the county, and we'll talk. Robert sent over the plan within a week. It was actually quite thorough, including restoring the stream bed contours, replanting native vegetation, and adding some erosion control features. The county approved it. I gave permission for the work with the stipulation that I'd supervise and they'd fix anything I wasn't satisfied with. The restoration took about a week. A professional crew came in and actually did good work, better than the area had been before. They reshaped the stream bed, brought in appropriate gravel and stones, and planted native grasses and plants along the banks. Of course, water wasn't going to magically return just because they'd fixed what they broke. The dry ditch was still dry because my pond and western drainage were still functioning exactly as designed. Robert called me after the work was complete. Mr. Larson, the restoration is done. I know the stream isn't flowing there anymore because of your pond project. I want to be very clear that we're not asking you to change your legal water management. But I wondered if you'd be willing to meet with me and a few board members just to discuss the situation and see if there's any path forward to reasonable neighborly relations. I thought about it. The vindictive part of me wanted to tell them to pound sand, to enjoy their dry ditch forever as a monument to their arrogance. But the practical part recognized that I lived next to these people, and ongoing hostility wasn't great for anyone. I'll meet with you. But I'm not making any promises about changing my water management. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop in town. Robert brought two other board members, Sharon Wu and David Martinez. All three seemed genuinely contrite and considerably more humble than Patricia had ever been. "First," Robert said, "I want you to know that Patricia Henderson is no longer involved with the HOA in any capacity. She was removed from the board, and we've implemented new policies requiring proper research and legal review before any construction projects." "That's a good start." Sharon spoke up. "We reviewed all the documentation. You were completely in the right. The previous board acted illegally and then compounded the problem by refusing to fix it. We've paid over $20,000 in fines and remediation costs because of their arrogance." "I'm sorry you're dealing with the consequences of someone else's decisions," I said, "but those consequences aren't my responsibility." "We understand," David added. "We're not here to ask you to undo your pond, but we wanted to ask if you'd be open to discussing an easement." "An easement?" Robert pulled out a document. "We'd like to propose purchasing a recreational easement across a portion of your property. It would give our residents legal access to walk on a defined trail area. In exchange, we'd pay you a fair market rate for the easement rights and commit to maintaining the trail at our expense. And the stream, that's separate. If you're willing, we'd discuss the possibility of restoring some water flow to the original stream bed, but only if you're interested and only with appropriate compensation. If you're not interested, the easement proposal stands alone. We just want to establish a proper legal relationship instead of the presumptuous trespassing that was happening before." I had to admit, I hadn't expected this level of reasonableness. "I need to think about it and talk to my attorney." "Of course. Take all the time you need." We just wanted to open the conversation the right way this time. I met with Tom Richardson later that week and showed him the proposal. "It's actually quite fair," Tom said. "They're offering $200 per year for a walking easement on a defined 20-foot wide trail corridor. That's reasonable compensation. The trail route they've proposed stays well away from your house and pond area, and the maintenance clause protects you from liability. What about the stream? That's up to you." They're proposing to pay for an engineering study to determine if there's a way to split the flow between your pond and the original stream bed without compromising your water rights. If such a solution exists and you approve it, they'd pay all costs of implementation plus an annual water rights fee. If you say no, they drop the issue entirely. Can I approve the easement without committing to the stream issue? Yes, they've structured it as two separate agreements specifically to give you that option. I thought about it for a few days. The truth was, the vindictive satisfaction of leaving them with a dry ditch was fading. I'd made my point. They'd paid a heavy price for their arrogance, and the new board seemed genuinely interested in doing things the right way. I called Robert Chen. "I'll agree to the trail easement under the terms proposed, but I want the contract to include a clause that if the HOA ever builds any structure on or near my property without explicit written permission again, the easement terminates immediately with no refund. That's completely fair." "What about the stream?" "I'm willing to allow the engineering study. If they find a solution that doesn't negatively impact my pond or water rights and if the compensation is fair, I'll consider it. But I'm not promising anything. That's all we can ask for." The contracts were drawn up, reviewed by both sides' attorneys, and signed by mid-July. The HOA paid me the first year's easement fee and scheduled the engineering study. The engineer, a professional hydrologist named Dr. James Park from the University of Tennessee, spent 2 days surveying my property and analyzing the water flow. His report concluded that it was possible to create a split-flow system that would maintain my pond at full capacity, while returning about 40% of the water flow to the original stream bed. The solution involved installing a control structure at the pond outflow that would direct the first priority of water to maintain pond levels, with excess flow splitting between the western drainage and a restored channel to the eastern stream bed. It would require some additional excavation and the installation of a concrete control weir, but Dr. Park assured me it would be reliable and require minimal maintenance. The HOA offered to pay all installation costs plus an annual water rights fee of $500. Additionally, they'd pay for any maintenance of the control structure and give me complete authority to shut off the eastern flow anytime I deemed necessary for pond management. I agreed. The installation took 3 weeks and was done professionally. By late August, water was flowing through the original stream bed again, though at a lower volume than before. It was enough to create a pleasant, babbling brook effect and support the ecosystem, but clearly not the same as it had been. Some of the HOA residents complained that the stream wasn't as impressive as before. Robert Chen's response, which I heard through the grapevine, was perfect. "We're lucky Mr. Larson was willing to restore any flow at all after how the previous board treated him. If you don't like it, you can thank Patricia Henderson for creating this situation in the first place." Life settled into a new normal. The trail easement worked well. Residents from Riverside Estates used the trail respectfully, staying on the defined path. The HOA maintained it properly, keeping vegetation trimmed and even installing some nice drainage features to prevent erosion. My pond became my favorite feature of the property. I spent summer evenings fishing for the bass and bluegill, watching herons and kingfishers hunt along the edges. The western drainage supported a thriving wetland ecosystem on the lower portion of my property. But the story didn't quite end there. In September, I got a call from Carol Peters at the County Environmental Management Office. "Mr. Larson, I wanted to give you a heads up. We've completed our full investigation into the Riverside Estates HOA's unpermitted construction activities. It turns out the violations were more extensive than we initially thought." "How extensive?" Patricia Henderson, as HOA president, authorized over $40,000 in construction projects without proper permits or property rights verification. Some of the work was on county land, some on private property belonging to others. We've referred the case to the district attorney's office. Criminal charges, potentially. At minimum, the DA is looking at criminal trespass, destruction of property, and fraud related to how she documented the expenditures to the HOA. She apparently told residents the projects had all proper approvals when she knew they didn't. Wow. There's more. We discovered she was getting kickbacks from the construction company doing the work. They'd inflate invoices, she'd approve them without proper oversight, and they'd pay her a percentage under the table. That's embezzlement from the HOA funds. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but they turned. Patricia Henderson was indicted in November on charges of criminal trespass, fraud, and embezzlement. The case made local news, partly because the amounts involved were significant and partly because it was such a brazen abuse of HOA authority. I was called to testify at her trial in February. The courtroom in Greene County was old-fashioned and formal, with wood paneling and high ceilings. Patricia sat at the defense table looking much less confident than she'd sounded on the phone dismissing my concerns about her illegal walkway. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Linda Morrison, walked me through the timeline of events. "Mr. Larson, when did you first discover the structure on your property?" "Late March of last year. I saw it from my deck one morning." And what did you do? I documented it with photographs, verified it was on my property using my survey documents, and then contacted the HOA to request its removal. How did the defendant respond to your request? She told me the stream was community property, which it wasn't, and that the walkway was staying. She suggested I take it up with the HOA's lawyers if I had a problem with it. Did she ever acknowledge that the structure was on your property? No. She insisted the HOA had a right to build it and refused to even consider removing it. Patricia's defense attorney tried to argue that she'd relied on bad information from the construction company about property boundaries and permits. But the prosecution produced emails and documents showing she'd been warned by multiple people, including another board member who'd since resigned, that the projects might be on property the HOA didn't own. The embezzlement charges were more serious. The prosecution showed that Patricia had received over $12,000 in kickbacks from the construction company over an 18-month period. She'd approved inflated invoices without competitive bidding and had hidden the arrangement from the rest of the board. The trial lasted 4 days. The jury deliberated for about 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Patricia Henderson was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with possibility of parole after 18 months. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA and to me for damages and legal fees. Additionally, she received 5 years probation after release and a permanent ban from serving in any HOA governance role. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness watching her led away after sentencing. Satisfaction because justice had been served, sadness because it was such a stupid, avoidable situation. If she just responded to my initial request with respect and reasonableness, none of this would have happened. The Riverside Estates HOA underwent significant reforms. Robert Chen and his new board implemented strict policies requiring legal review and property verification before any construction. They established transparent budgeting practices and term limits for board members. They even invited me to speak at a residents' meeting about property rights and being good neighbors. I stood in their community center that evening, looking out at about 60 faces, and told them the whole story from my perspective. I didn't start this conflict, I said. I just wanted what anyone would want, respect for my property rights. The previous board decided that what they wanted was more important than the law or basic courtesy. That decision cost your HOA over $60,000 in fines, legal fees, restitution, and remediation. It cost Patricia Henderson her freedom, all over a walkway that they could have built legally on their own property with just a bit more planning. A woman in the back raised her hand. Do you think HOAs are inherently bad? No. I think HOAs can serve useful purposes when they are run by reasonable people who understand their authority has limits. Your new board has been professional and respectful. We've established a good working relationship. But HOAs can also become vehicles for petty tyranny when the wrong people get control and forget that they're accountable to both their residents and the law. After the meeting, several residents came up to apologize personally for what I'd gone through. One older gentleman shook my hand firmly. I voted against Patricia every time she ran, but I was in the minority. She had this way of convincing people she was protecting property values, when really she was just drunk on the tiny bit of power the position gave her. I'm glad you fought back. Spring came around again, 1 year after I'd first spotted that walkway. My pond was thriving, now with frogs and turtles joining the fish population. The split flow system worked perfectly, maintaining my pond while providing enough water to the eastern stream to support life there too. The trail easement brought occasional hikers past my property, but they were respectful, staying on the designated path. Some would wave or say hello if I was outside. It felt like being part of a community instead of being at war with one. I'd even started attending the occasional HOA social event when invited. They had a summer barbecue in June that was actually pretty fun. Robert Chen introduced me as the guy who taught our HOA about property rights to a group of newer residents, and we all laughed about it. One evening in July, I was fishing at my pond when I heard footsteps on the trail. A woman about my age approached hesitantly. "Mr. Larson, I'm sorry to bother you. I'm Olivia Anderson. I just moved into the development last month. I wanted to introduce myself and thank you." Thank me. I did my research before buying. I learned about what happened with the previous HOA board and how you stood up to them. That's actually why I chose to buy here. I figured any HOA that had learned that kind of lesson the hard way was probably going to be run properly going forward. And from what I've seen, it is. We talked for a while. Olivia was a wildlife biologist who'd taken a position at the state park about 20 miles away. She was fascinated by my pond project and the water management system. You basically created a functioning wetland ecosystem while maintaining your legal rights and teaching your HOA board some necessary humility, she said. That's impressive. It wasn't about being impressive. It was about drawing a line when someone tried to walk over me. Sometimes drawing a line is the most impressive thing you can do. As summer faded into fall, I reflected on the whole bizarre saga. It had been stressful, expensive in terms of time and legal fees, and at times infuriating. But I'd stood my ground when it mattered. I'd enforced my property rights without doing anything illegal or unethical. And eventually, after consequences caught up with the people who'd wronged me, a better situation emerged than what existed before. The dry ditch that had briefly spanned where an illegal walkway once stood was now a flowing stream again, but on my terms and with proper legal agreements in place. The HOA that had once tried to bully me now treated me with respect. And the person who'd embodied the arrogance that started it all had faced real consequences for her actions. I received the final restitution check from Patricia's court, ordered payments in October. It covered my legal fees and some compensation for damages. I deposited it and used part of the money to build a nice deck overlooking my pond, with comfortable chairs and even a small fire pit for cool evenings. Sitting there on a crisp autumn evening, watching the sunset reflect off the water and listening to geese flying overhead, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not because I'd won some petty war, but because I'd defended something that mattered. Property rights, personal autonomy, the principle that no one, not even an official-sounding organization, has the right to take what isn't theirs. The stream babbled peacefully in the background, following the path I'd created for it, and that felt right. It was my land, my water, my right to manage it as I saw fit within the law. That's what freedom actually means, not the absence of responsibility, but the presence of choice and the authority to make decisions about your own property and life. Robert Chen called me in early November with unexpected news. "Vincent, I wanted to let you know first. The HOA is going to put up a small plaque at the trailhead near your property. It's going to explain the history of the trail easement and why property rights matter. We want future residents to understand what happened and why respecting legal boundaries is so important. You don't have to do that. We want to. It's part of making sure this never happens again. The plaque will acknowledge that the trail exists on your property by your generous permission, not by right, and that respecting that agreement is every resident's responsibility." The plaque went up in December. It was tasteful, made of bronze, mounted on a stone base. I went to look at it one morning and found the text surprisingly thoughtful. This trail crosses private property owned by Vincent Larson under a revocable easement agreement. Mr. Larson granted this easement after the previous HOA board illegally built structures on his land without permission, leading to legal action and criminal prosecution. This trail exists by his choice and generosity. All users must respect the boundaries and terms of the easement. Property rights matter. Courtesy matters. Community is built on mutual respect, not assumed entitlement. It wasn't what I expected, but I appreciated the honesty. They weren't hiding their mistake or sugar-coating what happened. They were owning it and using it as a teaching moment. Winter set in, and the pond partially froze over. The stream slowed to a trickle in the coldest weeks, but the control system continued working perfectly. I spent time planning improvements for the spring, maybe adding some native plantings around the pond edges and building a small dock for easier fishing access. Life had returned to peaceful, which was all I'd wanted in the first place. I hadn't asked for conflict, hadn't sought out a battle with the HOA. I just refused to be pushed around on my own property, and I'd been willing to stand firm until the situation resolved in a fair way. The experience taught me something important about modern property ownership, especially living near developments with HOAs. These organizations can be beneficial when run properly, providing shared services and maintaining common areas. But they can also become toxic when led by people who forget that their authority has strict limits. Patricia Henderson had forgotten those limits, or maybe never acknowledged them. She'd believed that her position as HOA president gave her the right to make unilateral decisions about property that wasn't hers. She'd mistaken the appearance of authority for actual authority, and that mistake had destroyed her life. I didn't take pleasure in her imprisonment, but I didn't feel guilty about it either. She'd made choices, illegal choices, and then compounded those choices by refusing to correct them when given the chance. Every step of the way, she could have chosen differently. She could have said yes when I asked her to remove the walkway. She could have checked property boundaries before building. She could have been honest with her board and residents about permits and approvals. She'd chosen otherwise at every turn, and consequences had followed. As for me, I'd learned that standing up for yourself matters, that property rights are worth defending, and that sometimes the right course of action is the one that feels difficult in the moment. It would have been easier to just accept the walkway, to avoid conflict, to let the HOA do what it wanted. But easier isn't always better, and backing down when you're clearly in the right just encourages the next boundary violation. Christmas came and went quietly. I had family visit for a few days, and my nephew loved fishing in the pond despite the cold weather. He caught a decent bass on the second day, and we took photos of him proudly holding it before releasing it back into the water. "This is so cool, Uncle Vincent," he said. "Did you really stop a whole stream to teach those HOA people a lesson?" I didn't stop it, I redirected it. And it wasn't about teaching a lesson, it was about protecting my property rights while they left me no other choice. Still sounds pretty awesome. I laughed. It was stressful more than awesome, but I'm glad it worked out. New Year's came, marking 2 full years since I'd bought the property and a little over a year since the walkway incident started. I stood on my deck at midnight, alone, watching stars in the clear winter sky and listening to distant fireworks from town. The property was quiet and peaceful, exactly as I'd wanted it to be when I bought it. The pond, the redirected stream, the trail easement, all of it worked together now in a way that respected everyone's rights and interests. It had taken conflict and consequences to get here, but we'd arrived at something sustainable. In January, I got a letter from Patricia Henderson. It came from the women's correctional facility where she was serving her sentence. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won out. The letter was handwritten, just 2 pages. Her handwriting was surprisingly neat. "Mr. Larson," it began. "You don't owe me anything, certainly not forgiveness or even acknowledgement of this letter. But my counselor here suggested I write to the people I've harmed as part of taking responsibility for my actions. You were right about everything. I was wrong, and worse, I was arrogant about being wrong. I convinced myself that my position gave me authority that it didn't actually give me. I ignored advice from people who knew better. I lied to my board and to residents. I took money I didn't earn from projects I shouldn't have approved. And when you asked me nicely to fix my mistake, I dismissed you because admitting I was wrong felt impossible. I destroyed my own life over a walkway that didn't need to exist. I'm sorry for what I put you through, for building on your land, for wasting your time and money fighting something that should have never been a fight. I understand if you hate me. I've learned to hate what I did. I hope you're doing well. Patricia Henderson." I read it twice, then filed it away with the rest of the documents from the case. I didn't respond, but I didn't throw it away either. It seemed important somehow, that acknowledgement of responsibility. It didn't change anything, but it closed something. February brought a warm spell, and I started working on the pond improvements I'd planned. I built a small floating dock, installed some fish habitat structures, and planted native wildflowers around the edges. Olivia Anderson from the HOA stopped by a few times to observe the wildlife, and we developed a friendship based on shared interests in ecology and conservation. "You know," she said one afternoon while photographing a great blue heron hunting along my pond edge, "what you did here is actually a textbook example of adaptive water management. You took a conflict situation and created something that benefits everyone. The stream still flows, your pond exists, and the whole ecosystem is more diverse than it was before. I just wanted them to leave my property alone. Sure, but the solution you created was elegant. A lot of people in your position would have just damned everything out of spite. You found a way to maintain your rights while still being reasonable. Being reasonable is easier when the other party finally starts being reasonable too." Spring arrived fully in March, 2 years after the initial walkway appeared. The anniversary wasn't lost on me as I walked down to check on the stream flow. The water ran clear over the restored stream bed, supporting aquatic plants and the creatures that depended on them. It wasn't the same stream that had existed before, but it was a living, functional waterway that existed because I'd chosen to restore it, not because someone had forced me to. That choice mattered more than people might think. The legal battle could have ended with me keeping all the water, leaving the stream bed completely dry forever. I'd had every right to do that. But once the HOA approached me with respect, acknowledged their mistakes, and offered fair compensation, I'd been willing to find a compromise. That's how things should work, not through entitlement and demands, but through respect and negotiation. The new HOA board understood that. The residents who used the trail understood that. Even Patricia from her prison cell apparently understood it now. I spent a morning in late March fishing, catching and releasing several nice bass. The pond had matured beautifully, developing the kind of balanced ecosystem that would sustain itself for years. As I sat there in the warming sun, I thought about all the work, stress, and conflict it had taken to arrive at this peaceful moment. Was it worth it? Absolutely. Not because I enjoyed conflict or wanted to punish anyone, but because principles matter. Property rights matter. The rule of law matters. The idea that people can't just take what they want because they have a title or a position matters. If I'd backed down, if I'd let the HOA keep their illegal walkway just to avoid trouble, what would that have taught them? That might makes right, that official-sounding organizations can ignore property rights, that individuals should roll over when confronted with institutional pressure. Instead, by standing firm, I taught a different lesson. That rights have meaning, that respect matters, that consequences follow actions, that individuals can stand up to institutions when those institutions act wrongly. The Riverside Estates HOA was better now because someone had drawn a line. Future residents would benefit from the reforms and the culture of accountability that had emerged from this situation. And I had my peace, my property rights intact, and my pride in knowing I hadn't let myself be bullied. As spring progressed into summer once more, I continued enjoying my property. The pond, the trail easement, the restored stream, all of it functioned exactly as designed. I'd occasionally see HOA residents on the trail, and they were always respectful, often friendly. Some would stop to chat, asking about the pond or commenting on the wildlife they'd seen. The relationship between me and the HOA had transformed from hostile to cooperative, but it was a cooperation built on proper foundations. Legal agreements, mutual respect, appropriate compensation, and clear boundaries. That's how neighbors should interact, whether individual to individual or individual to organization. One evening in August, Robert Chen stopped by with a bottle of wine and an invitation. "Vincent, the HOA is having our annual meeting next month. I know you're not a member, obviously, but we'd like to invite you as a guest of honor. Several of the newer residents have asked about the whole situation, and I think it would be valuable for them to hear directly from you. What would you want me to talk about? Just your experience. What happened, how you felt about it, how you responded, and what you learned. I think it's important for our community to remember that the common areas we enjoy exist alongside private properties, and that respecting those boundaries isn't optional." I agreed to attend. The meeting was held in early September in the community center. About 80 people attended, a good turnout according to Robert. I sat on a small stage with the board members, feeling slightly ridiculous, but also recognizing the importance of what they were trying to do. Robert introduced me with a summary of the situation, not sugarcoating the previous board's mistakes or Patricia's criminal actions. Then he turned the floor over to me. I told the story from the beginning. The morning I discovered the walkway, my attempts to resolve it reasonably, the dismissive response, my decision to take legal action on my own property, the consequences that followed. I explained the engineering solution that allowed partial restoration of the stream and how the trail easement established a proper legal relationship. The lesson here isn't that HOAs are bad, I concluded. It's that any organization, any leader, any individual can make mistakes. What matters is how you respond to those mistakes. The previous board made bad choices and then refused to correct them. The current board acknowledged the problems, made restitution, and established proper procedures to prevent it happening again. That's the difference between an HOA that destroys community and one that builds it. The question and answer session was lively. People asked about the legal process, the pond construction, the wildlife that had moved in, and my advice for property owners dealing with similar situations. A young man in his 30s raised his hand. "Did you ever regret redirecting the stream? Like, did you feel bad about it?" I thought about that. Honestly, no. I felt bad that it came to that, but the action itself was legal, permitted, and necessary given the circumstances. Would I have preferred to resolve it differently? Sure, but when someone refuses to respect your property rights, sometimes you have to demonstrate that those rights have teeth. The stream exists now because I chose to restore it after the HOA started acting properly, not because they forced me to. After the meeting, I stayed for refreshments and talked with residents. The overall sentiment seemed to be appreciation for my willingness to work with the new board and recognition that the previous situation had been wrong. An elderly woman approached me as I was getting ready to leave. "Young man, I want you to know I admire what you did. I've lived in HOAs most of my adult life, and I've seen too many boards forget they're supposed to serve the community, not rule it. You reminded this HOA of that distinction, and we're all better off for it." Driving home that evening, I felt a sense of closure that had been missing even after the legal cases concluded. The community understood what had happened. They'd learned from it, and they appreciated that I'd been willing to move forward constructively once things were made right. Fall brought cooler temperatures and the return of migratory birds. My pond became a regular stop for ducks and geese, and I spent many mornings watching them land and take off. The trail easement payment arrived on schedule, and the HOA maintained the trail beautifully. Everything worked the way it should when people act reasonably and respect proper boundaries. In November, I got a message that Patricia Henderson had been granted early parole for good behavior. She'd served about 16 months of her 3-year sentence. I felt nothing particular about the news. Her punishment had been appropriate, and her early release suggested she genuinely worked on rehabilitation. What she did with her freedom now was her business, not mine. December brought the first serious snow, blanketing everything in white. The pond froze over completely for the first time, and I enjoyed walking on the ice. The stream slowed to a trickle, just enough to prevent complete freezing. The control structure handled the winter conditions perfectly. As the year came to a close, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in the nearly 2 years since that walkway first appeared. I'd gone from peaceful solitude to intense conflict to a hard-won peace that was actually better than the original situation. I had legal agreements protecting my interests, compensation for my property use, and a neighborly relationship with the HOA that was built on mutual respect rather than assumptions. The property looked better too. The pond added visual interest and recreational value. The wetland area on the western drainage had become a haven for wildlife. Even the restored eastern stream, though diminished, supported life and added pleasant ambience. All of it emerged from conflict, from standing firm on principles, from refusing to accept that someone else's convenience mattered more than my property rights. Would I do it all again if faced with the same situation? Absolutely. Would I wish for the situation to arise? Never. But life doesn't always give us easy choices. Sometimes defending what's right requires effort, stress, and conflict. The important thing is being willing to make that effort when it matters. I spent New Year's Eve on my pond dock, bundled against the cold, watching stars and thinking about the journey. 2 years ago, I'd bought a beautiful property with a natural stream. Then someone tried to take advantage of that property for their own purposes. Now I had something even better. The same beautiful property, enhanced by a pond and improved water management, protected by legal agreements, and surrounded by neighbors who'd learned to respect boundaries. The stream, my stream, whether flowing through the original bed or my redirected channels, symbolized something important. Water follows the path created for it. People, organizations, and communities do too. The previous HOA board had created a path of arrogance and entitlement, and they'd followed it to disaster. The current board created a path of respect and accountability, and they were following it to success. I'd created my own path too, one of standing firm on principles while remaining open to reasonable solutions. That path had led through conflict but emerged into peace, and that made all the difference.